We've probably got tonight about 2 or 3 hours of conversation that we're going to cram into 45 minutes. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time introducing it, other than to say, if you have your Bible, and I hope you do, turn with me to Numbers. We're going to be in chapters 13 and 14. It's the book of Numbers, so it's way back at the beginning. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, then Numbers, your fourth book of the Bible. Numbers chapter 13, and we're going to read 13 and 14 in chunks. And time permitting, I hope we'll get through the whole thing. As you're turning, I want to talk a little bit about defining God's call in your life. I've entitled this study, Too Much to Lose. And I think sometimes we're afraid to follow God's will because of what it costs us. There's just too much at stake for us to risk what God may call us to do. And so I'm going to look at that poor mindset, because it is a poor mindset, but an honest mindset, in Numbers chapter 13 and 14. Starting off, I want to define God's call. There's really two different types of decisions, the way I see it, in our everyday lives. One are what I would call big decisions. Right? These are the decisions that are, where am I going to live? Right? Town, house, whatever it would be, whether it's a city, a state, sometimes a country, a specific location. Where am I going to put my roots down? Big questions like, what am I going to do? And this is something we ask when we're young, but if we're honest, most people change jobs several times in their life. It's a big change to go from one job to another job. What's my profession going to be? How about who will I marry, or what will my relationships be? Decisions that we wrestle with when we're younger, but even as we get older, some of us are still trying to, I say us, I'm happily married. Let me rephrase that. Some people are. That's right. Some people are still trying to find, okay, who, God, do you want me to settle down with? And you're absolutely right. Who in my life do I want to build stronger friendships and relationships with? Or how about this? How will I serve? And you think of this in a church context. Where does God want me to put my roots down, to join and be a part of a family together? These are big decisions, right? Things that happen not every day, but things that happen a few times in your life. And then we have what we'll say are the small decisions, right? Little things like, what am I doing to grow in my faith? Have I made a decision to read Scripture the amount I need to, or to spend time in prayer the way I want to pray, or am I devoted to coming to church on a week in, week out basis? They're a little smaller, right? They don't have rippling effects the same way we think the big decisions do. How about this? A small decision like, am I going to be obedient in this particular matter? Not small in importance, but small in the fact that it's not what we would consider life-changing or earth-shattering. Small decisions like, what are my priorities? Is it important for me to be certain places, or to have certain priorities in my life? Or are there other things I can push to the side? So let me ask you this. Which are the more important decisions, the big decisions or the small decisions?
They're all important, but we have a tendency of prioritizing. And a lot of us, just our makeup, our sense of obedience, just a lot of things that we channel. But small ones, it's just like when a person gets saved, one of the first things, one thing you want to really do is get them baptized in the church.
Right.
That's a simple little step.
Absolutely.
But how important is it?
Right.
In the scheme of things. So
I think you're right. They're all important. I don't want to say big decisions, small decisions have different importance. However, I do think we tend to prioritize the big decisions. And here's how I know this. Some of you do come in to talk to the pastor when there's big decisions in your life, or even small decisions. More people come in to talk to the pastor when they've got a big decision than a small decision. By far. By far. Not everybody. There are people who come in. As a matter of fact, this week, had people come in and say, hey, I need help with certain small decisions, right? And I praise God for those moments. But most of the people who come in for counseling want biblical advice on the big things. And I think you're right. We often prioritize some over the others. Now, Les over here quickly said small, and I don't disagree. So follow up on, was that you that said that? Or was that? Oh. Wasn't, no. Was that you, Monty? Oh, okay. Was that you, Gavin? Why do you say small decisions?
Well, by the way you put big decisions and also small decisions, like the way you describe both of them, the way it seems like the big decisions are the outward and the small decisions are the inward. Well, honestly, you gotta figure out what type of person you are before you can figure out where you're gonna be, what you're gonna do.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, right? A lot of times these big decisions are impacted by each small decision we've made along the way. I like the way you put that, Gavin. You got to figure out who you are before you can make those big decisions. And I think there's a lot of biblical wisdom in that. You know, each of these big decisions are important, and we need to really take time to think about and answer these questions. They're not insignificant. But if we don't understand that the small decisions impact how we react to the big decisions, we miss the whole priority. We miss the whole importance of the day-to-day decisions. Think about this. You probably look to change your job 2, 3, maybe 4 times your entire life. Right? Maybe. Some people even less. But you make decisions daily, 3 or 4 times, on whether you will be obedient to what God wants you to do. The small decisions probably make up 90% of the decisions we make, or more. So I want to talk about those day-to-day decisions that we often think are small and insignificant, but how they impact our future big decision prospects. So we're going to be in Numbers chapter 13. We're going to see Israel's failure to accurately assess the importance and the benefit of being obedient in small things, of looking at circumstances and letting it impact big decisions that they make. We're going to read, hopefully, both chapters, time permitting, but we're going to do it in chunks. And as we lead up to Numbers chapter 13, some background. God has promised Abraham way back in the book of Genesis that his descendants would be a great nation and have a specific land. One man and his family, the promise. Your descendants will be numerous and will end up being a great country in a specific land. Let me ask you, what major events happened after that would lead us up to now Israel getting ready to enter that land? What are some things that have happened between Abraham and now this great nation coming to this land?
Slavery.
All right, so most recently they were slaves in Egypt.
Before that, there was a famine that brought them to Egypt.
All right, so there was a famine that brought this family to Egypt, right? What are some other events that have happened?
Been wandering around for a few years.
Yeah, are they still in Egypt? They're not, right? God has brought them out of Egypt, and they've been wandering around, actually at this point in Numbers, wandering around probably weeks and months. We're not to the 40-year wandering yet. We're going to see the reason why they wandered 40 years in Numbers 13 and 14. But yeah, they have been in the wilderness for a while now, right? And mind you, not only have they been in the wilderness, but this is important. How did they get to where they're at? How were they led, and how do they survive in the wilderness? What's happened?
God provided for them.
Yeah, God literally, his presence literally is leading them, right? Like during the day, they see this cloud that they can follow, and at night they see this fire that they've seen God leading them and directing them where to go. You see God's hand in this family and their nation all throughout leading up to Numbers 13. Right? Bringing them to Egypt and raising them up into a great nation. Having them fall into slavery, but God saving them from that. Let's not forget how God got them out of Egypt and across the Red Sea, right? Like literally they watched water split open so they could walk across on dry ground. And then they watched that same water when the Egyptians followed after them consume the Egyptian army and drown them. I mean, the might and the power of God they have seen is unbelievable. One other thing we've not mentioned is leading up to this time and coming into the land, they received some instructions directly from God. Like God gave them 10 specific commandments that wrote down on tablets for them to follow. And while they were receiving that, Moses was receiving that, what were the people doing at the foot of the mountain? Building an idol. God wanted to, by the way, this is important, God wanted to wipe them out at that point, and Moses prays on their behalf, and God does not wipe the people out. He allows them still to get to the land. We have seen, here's my point, we have seen in this story thus far God's might and his power. We've seen his mercy and his grace. We've seen his leadership and his sovereignty. God has been all over this nation. It's like impossible for them to miss it. And that's where we get to in Numbers chapter 13. I want to read the first 16 verses of Numbers chapter 13. And again, we'll take this in chunks. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I'm giving to the people of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them." So Moses sent from them the wilderness of Paran, according to the command of the Lord, all of the men who were heads of the people of Israel. And these were their names. From the tribe of Reuben, Shemua the son of Zakur. The tribe of Simeon, Shaphat the son of Hori. From the tribe of Judah, Caleb the son of Jephunneh. I hope I'm pronouncing all these right. Do I sound confident enough? Good. Okay. From the tribe of Issachar, Igal son of Joseph. From the tribe of Ephraim, Hoshea son of Nun. From the tribe of Benjamin, Palti the son of Raphu. From the tribe of Zebulun, Gadiel the son of Zodi. From the tribe of Joseph, that is, from the tribe of Manasseh, Gadi the son of Suzi. From the tribe of Dan, Amiel the son of Jamali. From the tribe of Asher, Sethur the son of Michael. And from the tribe of Naphtali, Nabi the son of Vophsi. From the tribe of Gad, Gul the son of Machai. And these were the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land. And Joseph called Hoshea the son of Nun, Joshua. So we see that leaders from each tribe are appointed to go and check this land out. Let me ask you, what names do you recognize in the list from chapter 13, verse 4 through 15? Honestly, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, you probably only recognize 2 of these spies, maybe only 1. What names do you recognize here?
Caleb and Joshua.
Caleb, oh, but you know what? We don't have Joshua in this list quite yet.
Hoshea.
Right. But we don't have Joshua yet. This is important to understand a name change here in just a second, right? We know Caleb, and we know a man named Joshua, but I want you to catch it. His name's not Joshua to start with. Does anybody know what Hoshea means?
My name's going to change.
It means, I don't know what my name is, right? It literally means he saves. So he's named in hopes that he'll be some sort of hero or savior, right? He saves. But Moses changes his name to Joshua or Yeshua. Does anybody know what that name means?
Jehovah says.
Jehovah, Yahweh saves. God saves, right? This is going to be important because of Joshua's role in this story. But these are the only 2 men that we recognize. We recognize them because most of us know how this story goes. We're going to continue reading and look at the mission that they're put under. Look with me in verses 17 through 24. Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, "Go up to the Negeb and go up to the hill country and see that the land is, see what the land is, and whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, whether they're few or many, and whether the land that they dwell is in good or bad, and whether the cities that they dwell in are camps or strongholds, and whether the land is rich or poor, whether there be trees in it or not. Be of good courage and bring some of the fruit from the land." Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. So they went up and spied out the land, from the wilderness of Zin to Rehob, near Lebo Hamath, and they went into the Negeb, and they came to Hebron, and Ahamin, and Sheshai, and Talmai. The descendants of Enoch were there. Take note of that. The descendants of Enoch were there. Hebron was built several years before Zoan in Egypt. And they came to the valley of Eshcol and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes. And they carried it on a pole between 2 of them. They also brought some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because a cluster that the people of Israel cut down from there. Real quick, what was their mission in these verses? What did Moses tell them to go and look for? What are they supposed to report on?
Food and water.
What's that?
Food and water, basically.
All right, so what kind of provisions are in the land? Tell me what the land is like. Is there food in the land, right? What else?
The people there are strong or weak.
All right, check out and see if there's strong people or weak people, right? We got a military decision to make here. Are they strong people or weak people? What else? Yeah. What's that?
Gold.
They weren't necessarily looking for gold, but they were looking for what kind of things were in the land that would benefit them, right? So we talked about provisions that the land might provide. Not necessarily gold, but food is what they were really concerned about.
Like
Yeah.
camp or stronghold, like,
Yeah, they're cities, right? Are there cities just like little tents? Or they have like strong brick buildings, right?
the way I took it was whether it's a city or if it's people that's in prison.
Yeah, I think what they're really looking for is if it's a camp that's just like they got a few tents and could easily be knocked down, or if it's a stronghold, like a fortified city that you're not getting through their walls. So they want to know how strong their cities are. Can we as a people come and take their cities? 3 things. So let's summarize. 3 things they're to look for. A report on the people, big or small. A report on the quality of land. Can we survive here? Is there food for us here? Is there ways for us to farm, raise cattle? And third, a report on city strength. Can we take these cities or not? In verse 22, one city that they come to is a place called Hebron. This is an important place in this passage because Hebron is the very place where most of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, are buried, them and their wives. And it's the very place that God promised to Abram. This will be the land, right here. This is what I'm going to give you and your descendants. There's a clear picture that God has led them exactly where he promised to lead them. We do find specific people that are in the land, also in verse 22. They're the descendants of Anak. The word Anak is a word that means neck or has to do with neck, and it's this idea that they are very tall, giant people. Right? They have long necks, thick necks, strong necks. These are warriors. And they notice that these strong descendants of Anak are present. I do want us to think about what we just read, and we went through it quickly, but pay attention to the details, but also the lack of details of what they saw. Because they're about to give a report, and I want us to compare what they saw to what they reported. Okay? Let's read verses 25 through 33. Let's read about their report. At the end of the 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought word back to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey. Literally, that means it has a wealth of ways to provide for our livestock and to provide for us for food. It said, and this is its fruit, the big pole with a cluster of grapes. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. Let me ask you, how would you describe the report of the spies to this point? What is it that they're reporting? Remember, 3 questions. They want to know, 1, about the people. What's their report of the people?
Strong and fortified.
Strong people. And that skips to the cities. What are they reporting about the cities? They're fortified, right? Large groups of people, sons of Anak, descendants of Anak, all these other people and their cities, they don't live in tents, guys. They're not nomads. As a matter of fact, some of the walls that they've excavated from this time period have walls of their city that were as wide as 24 feet of wall. Like, this is the fortified nature of the cities they're looking at. What about the report of the quality of the land? What do they say about the land? Flowing with milk and honey. It's got all the good stuff. And think about the grapes they brought back. Did you catch they got one cluster of grapes? You get a cluster of grapes at Walmart, it comes in a little bag.
They carried it between two men.
The cluster of grapes they brought, the single cluster of grapes took 2 men hanging on a pole to carry it out, right? So is the land good? But you notice their report. The land's good, it's got all this, everything's great, look at the food, look at the grapes. And then verse 28, however, all right, let's get the good out of the way, but let me report to you, the people, they're strong and their cities are fortified. They end on the negative. Now, I don't know if you've ever spoke or given a report of anything, but you usually close and conclude with what you want people to know the most. Right? So what are they emphasizing here? This land, guys, we're not ready for it. Verse 30, Caleb's got a different plan and a different idea. Verse 30, but Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. You know what I love about this verse? Caleb heard the same report that everybody else heard. But you know what he heard? He heard, the food's good, God's called us, let's go. Right? Like, it's not even like he was trying to debate the report. The report was true. Instead, Caleb says, guys, isn't it great? Look at the land, flowing with milk and honey, the grapes, and the Lord is with us. Let's go.
Wasn't Caleb one of the spies too?
Yeah, Caleb's one of the spies. Yeah,
He's seen it himself.
he's watched it. He's seen all the giants, and he's still going, but this is what God's called us to do. Let's go. I love Caleb. By the way, you can fast forward several chapters when they actually do enter the land, and Caleb's 80 years old. One of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. He's 80 years old, and he goes and takes up the giants. Like, it's awesome. Caleb is not caring about the circumstances. God's given us the land. Let's go. The report gets worse from the others, though. Look at verse 31. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we're not able to go up against the people, for they're stronger than we. So, listen to verse 32. They brought the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And we saw the Nephilim, the son of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Though the report was accurate at the beginning, it emphasized the wrong things. Caleb sees the same thing. His conclusion is, God's promised it. The circumstances don't keep us from accepting it. Verse 31, the rest of the spies look and say, the people are stronger than I am. Is this a report or is this an evaluation? Right? They're not giving an objective report now. They've made a decision. The people are stronger than we are. You know, in one sense, they were right. In one sense, the people were taller and mightier and more warriors and fortified. But what is missing from their evaluation here on the strength of the people versus the strength of them?
Yeah, they're not stronger than God.
The Lord is with them, right? The people of the land are not stronger than the Hebrews. But yet they make an evaluation, and then in verse 32 they decide to give a bad report. What did they learn about the quality of the land? It provided. But what did they report about the land? It devours. Do you notice how their mindset, do you notice how their circumstances changed their report? Ultimately, they get to verse 33 and they say that we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. This is the third time we've heard about big, giant people, but how many times thus far have we heard about the Nephilim? This is the first time. Now, there are all sorts of theories on the Nephilim that we're not going to jump into tonight. We just don't have time to. There's a lot of theories. They come from people in the book of Genesis, where sons of God were procreating with daughters of men, and what that means is so many different guesses. Many of them were condemned in the flood. Part of their sinfulness is what caused God to look at the world and send the flood. And so then there's just one family, and now all of a sudden the Nephilim are popping up again. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, there may be ways that the Nephilim survived the flood through Noah and his family. That's a whole other subject. But most likely, the Nephilim were destroyed. And so their report very likely is a glamorization of what they see.
Well, the report starts out as a lie.
It is. It's the land is devouring, and the people are Nephilim, which may or may not, depending on how we understand the Nephilim, even still exist.
The fish was this big.
Right. That's it. It's this exaggeration to prove a point. Now, that being said, this could be Nephilim. We don't know, but my point is, why when they went into the land did they look around and say, there's the sons of Anak? And it wasn't until they give a report that they go, hey guys, it's the Nephilim. It seems to me like they're picking and choosing the circumstances to paint a picture because they don't have obedient faith. Do you have a question, Gavin?
A thing on Nephilim, with what I was taught, it's very possible they could have just popped up after, because I was taught it was fallen angels.
Well, there's a lot of theories. I don't want to delve into Nephilim because it could get us on a way off rabbit trail. But there's a lot of different theories, including what you said, fallen angels before the flood. However, the important thing is the exaggeration that's going on here. Right? The giants that are in the land are not just these tall descendants of Anak, but they may very well be those Nephilim that were the reason the whole flood came. These are bad people. We don't want to mess with them. And so we see that the people are giving a bad report, but Joshua is having none of it. Look at the people's reaction to the report and then Joshua's reaction to the people. Look at verse 1 of chapter 14. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we would have died in the land of Egypt, or that we would have died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let's choose a leader and go back to Egypt. What were the people's response here in verse 14 or chapter 14? What was their new desire?
Only we were dead.
Right. Like, we might as well have died in Egypt. We're going to die here anyways. Right?
Go back to Egypt.
Yeah. Well, why can't we just go back to Egypt? We could be slaves. Being slaves is better than this.
It wasn't this. That is your good.
What's that?
It wasn't that.
And it's-
Right. Yeah. You
it's
forget.
Sowing just a little seed of doubt is what started this, right? Because they were told, I'm presuming they were told that God is going to lead you into the land of milk and honey, and now the spies come back and say, no, this is a bad place. Well, now
Right.
the Lord's lied to you. So
And-
they think.
And that's exactly the point, right? It's not just that they've been told it, but what do we start off by saying? What had God done between Abraham and this point? God has left no doubt that he's giving them the land. And yet, these 10 men, because we're going to find Joshua's with Caleb, these 10 men are sowing that seed. And the people go, it wasn't that bad in Egypt. I mean, it was hard work, but it was living, right? We can make it. Think about their requests in verse 2. We mentioned it. 1, I wish we'd just died in Egypt. Or 2, I wish we'd just die in the wilderness. But what are their fears in verse 3? What do they fear the most in verse 3?
Die by the sword.
Yeah, we're going to fall and die by the sword. At least in Egypt, we might have been beat to death, but it wasn't going to be a sword, you know. What's their other fear in verse 3?
The women and children.
Our wives and our kids. You know, at least in Egypt, they were only beating us men. But now, these cities are going to attack our families. Here's what they're saying. The cost of obeying God in this moment is just too much. Like, we cannot go into this land because we have too much to lose. It'd be better if we were in Egypt and our kids were raised in slavery than be slaughtered by these people. And can I tell you, I think I agree when you take God out of the equation of their assessment. Like if I've got a choice between brutal misery or death, I don't know, depending on how bad the misery is, but most of us want to live, right? The problem is what I just said, when you take God out of the equation. Their thoughts are, we have too much to lose, we cannot do this. And finally they say, let's pick a different leader. Moses isn't getting it done. He's sent these guys out, and what we found is where he's led us has gotten us nowhere. Look at verses 5 and following. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the people of Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, a sign of grief. And they said to the congregation, the people of Israel, the land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he'll bring us into this land and give it to us, in the land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Think of that phrase for just a second and what that means. For they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. What was Caleb and Joshua's response? What made them believe that their conquest would be successful?
God.
If the Lord is with us, we're mightier. They start off by saying, guys, the land is good. You're focusing on the wrong thing. The blessing of what God has given us, that's what we need to look at. And then they go as far as to say, God's already gone in advance. Right? They say things like their protection is removed. And then I love this phrase, the people are like bread to us. What do you think that means?
Easy to cut down.
There's several things that make me think of. One is bread is not real hard to tear apart. Secondly, what is bread good for?
Eating.
Devouring. Oh, you think the people will devour us? No. Those people, we can break them down, and with God on our side, we devour them. I love that picture that Joshua and Caleb paint there. So the people respond in verse 10 after a nice rallying cry and a come on guys, we can do this. In verse 10 then all the congregation said to stone them with stones. But the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of the meeting of all the people of Israel. God intervenes after the people say, enough, let's kill these and murder these men. God finally does what he did to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and to Pharaoh and to the people at the Red Sea and to the people in the wilderness. God shows up and the people tremble in fear. I'm going to quickly move on because we've just got a few more minutes. I want to get through a couple of big turning points in this. Verse 11 and following, the Lord turns and says to Moses, how long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have done among them? Listen to God's solution. I'll strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make you a nation greater and mightier than they. This is important in verse 12. What is God's response to the people in verse 12?
I'm done with you.
Let's wipe them out. Moses, let's start over with you. By the way, this isn't an empty threat from God. If you remember, he's done this before. First of all, he started this nation with one man, Abraham. He could make a great nation out of one man. But go further back, when the world was exceedingly wicked, when the people God created were exceedingly wicked, when the Nephilim were doing their thing and were exceedingly wicked, God looks at Noah and says, I'm starting over with you. This is not an empty threat from God. God's response to unfaithfulness isn't light because sin is deserving of God's wrath. So then in verse 13 and following, Moses prays. This is the second time Moses has to pray to save the people. Moses said to the Lord in verse 13, then the Egyptians will hear of it, for you brought this people in your might from among them. And they'll tell the inhabitants of the land that they've heard from you, O Lord, that you're in the midst of this people. For you, O Lord, are seen face to face. Your cloud stands over them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill this people as one man, Then the nations who have heard your fame will say, it's because of the Lord, who was not able to bring this people into the land he swore to give them, and that he has killed them in the wilderness. And now, please, let the power of the Lord be great, as you have promised, saying the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers, the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Please pardon the iniquity of this people, according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now. Moses makes two appeals in his prayer to God. One is an appeal to God's character in verses 13 through 16. He says, God, your name needs to be great. People who are witnessing what's happening with Israel have seen your power and your might. You need to keep showing that power and that might. Secondly, he appeals to God's promises in verse 17 and 19. Didn't you promise to deliver these people? Haven't you promised to be merciful? Haven't you promised to be slow to anger and abounding in love and a forgiving God? Moses appeals to God's character and his promises. As a note, in verse 20, we read, the Lord said, I've pardoned according to your word. We don't have time to delve into this because we're running out and there's more I want to hit on. But God does not change his mind, nor can we assume that Moses influenced God's decision. As a matter of fact, the Lord says to Moses, I have pardoned according to your word. But if we remember what we just talked about, Moses' word was God's promises. Really, God acted according to his own word, right? So lest we presume that somehow we can change God's mind, it is not possible. But to show God's power, to show his mercy, he allows Moses to intercede. I want to continue reading on because while we could dwell on that, I want to conclude with the last few verses. God says, as truly as I live, as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and the wilderness, and yet have put me to test these 10 times, have not obeyed my voice. None of them shall see the land that I swore to give their fathers. And none of those who despise me shall see it. But my servant Caleb, because he was a different spirit and has followed me fully, I'll bring into the land in which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. And since the Amalekites and the Canaanites dwell in the valleys, turn tomorrow and set out for the wilderness by the Red Sea. Verse 26, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, how long shall this wicked congregation grumble against me? I've heard the grumblings of the people of Israel, which they grumble against me. Say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing, I will do to you. Your dead bodies will fall in this wilderness. And all of your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward who have grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land that I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. But your little ones, who you said would become prey, I'll bring in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. According to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years. You shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely this will I do to all, the wicked congregation who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness I shall come to a full end, and there they shall die. Briefly, what is Israel's punishment? Well, in verse 29, all the men of fighting age who didn't want to enter the land get what they want. They don't enter the land. Everybody 20 years and older, all those warriors that said, we can't do it, God says, fine, you won't. God gives them what they want. Verse 31, the people doubted God's protection over their children, so God demonstrates how protective he is. You may die, but your children, I'll protect them and they'll go in the land. You're so worried that I can't keep your family, and watch, they're the only ones that I'm going to protect. Verses 33 and 34. They desired to return to the wilderness back in verse 2. And guess what God says? You get to go back into the wilderness. If that's really what you desire and really what you want, that's where you'll be for 40 years. 1 year for each day that you spend in the land. And the promise is that an entire generation, 20 years and older, will die off, will not get to inherit the promise of God. When we read it, basically what God says is, I will give you exactly what you want. By the way, I still think that's how God works with our sin and our rebellion to Him. We had a really good conversation with our high school students at our house a couple Sunday nights ago about God's sovereignty. And ultimately what we talked about is that God does not force anyone to be a puppet. We all are responsible for our own decisions. And yet God somehow is in control of all things. Here's the best way I know how to explain it. God's desire, because you're created in His image, is to allow you to have your own decision on whether you want to represent Him or not, whether you want to be His image or not, whether you want to be obedient or not. How that works with God's sovereignty, that's for us to battle with. But how that works biblically is a clear picture over and over and over again that God allows us to be how we decide. And so, when the people want to go to the wilderness, guess where they go? The wilderness. So when the people say, I want my children protected, God says, fine, but I'm only protecting them. When the people say, we refuse to go and fight in the land, God says, don't worry about it. I'm never sending you in there. What we find is ultimately every decision we make, we are morally accountable for. God is in control, no doubt. But ultimately, we have to, from our perspective, say, God, I either surrender to you or I don't. Lack of time, so we're not going to read the rest of the chapter, but I would encourage you to see where the story goes after that. I'll summarize it. In the next 3 verses, God sends a plague and wipes out the 10 spies that refuse to go in the land. They all die. It's funny that they use the word a plague, because what did God use 10 of in Egypt to save the people? But plagues.
And they escaped from them there.
The people escaped, but those who were guilty, the Egyptians, did not. So here we see God sending 10 plagues again on 10 men, a plague for each man to wipe them out. If you read on in the rest of the chapter, verse 39 and following, what we read about is the people deciding God's right after all. God, you really can send us into the land. And Moses warns them, God has made a decision, but the people decide on their own, I think we can do this. And so they go and they make an attack, and they're driven back and they're driven out. It's a reminder that when we try to do things on our own, we always fail. If we would just surrender to the word and will of God, all the success and blessing we would have. Thoughts, comments tonight as we wrap up. Making decisions to be obedient and how that affects maybe the next 40 years of our lives. As we rush through this, I almost wish we made this a 2-week thing, but I've got plans for next week's study, so I didn't want to break it up into 2 weeks. I hope and pray that if you got questions, you can come and talk to me afterwards and see if we can be encouraged together. Let me pray, and then we'll transition, actually go pick up our kids, and then transition to a time of business. Father, I thank you so much for your word. I thank you for how you show us your grace, your mercy, your power, your strength. But Lord, in the midst of your sovereignty and control, how you show us we're each still responsible, morally responsible for the decisions that we make to obey or disobey. So Father, I pray that in spite of the circumstances that tell us we've got too much to lose, that we would surrender ourselves to your will and your will alone. We ask all this in your name.